and welcome to this 150th episode of Property Question Time. The show launched in 2017 and we are still here answering all your questions that you send in to us. We're here today filming from the heart of Docklands. I'm Shona Lindsay and I'm joined today in the studio by three experts. Let me start by introducing you to Simon Zutshi, who is the author of international bestseller Property Magic and the founder of Property Investors Network. Next, I have to introduce you to a gentleman who was actually on the very first show. He has filmed 28 episodes. That means he's answered 56 of your questions. And bizarrely, and quite unplanned, he also happened to feature in the 50th and the 100th episode. So, welcome, Paul Mahoney, who is the Managing Director of Nova Financial Group. And last but not least, please let me introduce you to Garrett O'Hanlon, who is the Founding Director of MAP Surveyors. So, first of all, because this is a special episode, I wanted to ask you all individually what your memories were and any, high points, low points, and how you felt about doing this programme and the viewers' questions. So perhaps I could start with you, Simon.
Yeah, I think there's been some great questions, and there have been lots that have been ones that I'm sure other viewers have benefited from learning from and hearing the general advice that the panel of experts have been able to provide. And it's great that we're able to share some wisdom and hopefully save people some money and save them some time and really make sure they're making the most of their property investing.
Have you had any weird questions that you thought, why on earth am I answering this? And
yeah,
how can I make this sound
There are some
helpful?
Peculiar ones, I think. And I think sometimes people like to ask one very, very long question. It seems like they haven't taken a breath. They say, and this is my situation, and this, and this, and this, and you kind of think, well, okay, yeah, try and simplify it. And I guess human nature is we like to complicate things a little bit for ourselves. And so there have been some strange ones. Nothing really stands out, but there have been some where we kind of thought, that's going to be a long answer.
It's probably because people get stressed. I mean,
Yeah,
buying
course.
property and investing in property can be quite stressful. So they're trying to get all their thoughts out there in one go.
I think so, yeah.
Paul, you've obviously done lots of these episodes. So anything stand out to you?
Yeah, look, as Simon said, I think across the 150 episodes, we probably had pretty much every question there is to ask. And I think it's great that the depth of expertise across the different panellists that we've had across those 150 episodes as well really gives a good rounded take on how people can approach very different and various circumstances when it comes to both buying a home to live in and investing in property and the considerations from a mortgage perspective and all the other expertise that have been commented on. So I think that's great. I think it's a really good starting point or refresher for people to watch these episodes and get a feel for what's going on.
Yeah.
Similar in a way that there's some questions that we simply don't have enough information or time to answer. And there's others that are very detailed,
yes.
And again, we probably don't have enough time to answer them. But there has definitely been some great questions, and I'm sure a lot of people just from hearing those questions and the answers to them have learnt an awful lot.
Brilliant, thank you. Garrett, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think if you're an intending property purchaser, you could do a lot worse than try and catch up on as many episodes as possible because, as Paul says, there's been a whole gamut of questions and topics which have been covered across various disciplines. And I think certainly it's great as a professional to get that kind of feedback from people. And we've modified some of the things that we do on the basis of questions that I've seen in this programme.
Really? Oh,
And
that's
also
interesting.
that, I personally have learnt stuff from my co-presenters, panellists at different times too. So it's a fantastic resource for people, and I would catch up with as many episodes as you possibly can.
And how does it compare to your different worlds, your real jobs, if you like, coming in here and doing this sort of thing? Is it a very different experience for you than climbing into a loft space?
Yeah, well, if you work in people's houses, all life is there. So this is a nice, clean, comfortable environment. So, yeah, this is all right.
That's what the people can see on the camera. We're not talking about what's under the table. Well, let's crack on with the questions. So, first of all, Simon, as you are at the head of the line, let's start with yours. A nice, simple question, or maybe not. Simple in the amount of words. How do I get started on crowdfunding? It seems to be very complex.
Okay, so there are two basic things you need to be aware of. There are two fundamental types of crowdfunding. One is where there are platforms that will go and find great property projects, and you can actually buy into those as a shareholder, an equity stake on. That's crowdfunding.
Right.
And you can invest very small amounts to large amounts. It's great for someone who maybe doesn't have enough money to buy their own property. They could take their money to diversify amongst a number of different properties. And so it's a pretty good way to get started if you can't buy your own. So that's crowdfunding. And then you also have peer-to-peer lending, which is where instead of actually getting an equity stake in a property, you lend money to someone who's doing a property project and they're going out to the crowd to borrow some funds instead of going to a traditional bank. And the developers quite like that because they like to give some return and share some of the profits with individuals, just normal people, instead of the banks making the money. And so it's very important that when you go to a platform, it's done properly. It's got to be FCA regulated to make sure they're doing things in the correct way. I'd always look into the experience of the people who are behind the platform, make sure that they understand what property is all about, because you sometimes get people who are financiers or technology people applying that to property. There's nothing wrong with that, but if they're assessing and doing due diligence on a project, you want to make sure they really understand what they're doing. I'd also encourage you to accept some personal responsibility and do some due diligence yourself. If a project looks good, you can check out what's the value, what the rents, make sure it's going to make money and be a viable project to support. The other thing you need to consider is how long you're tying your money up for in a project. If you're putting money into a property to get some equity, typically it's going to be probably a 5-year hold at least to get some capital growth over time. If it's peer-to-peer lending, it might be a much shorter period of time, maybe 12 or 18 months. So again, thinking about the money you're putting in, you're probably committing and tying that money up for a reasonable amount of time. There's risk with any investment you make, so make sure you understand the risk and weigh it up against the reward. And I'd suggest, putting your toe in the water with a very small amount of money.
What's the smallest amount of money?
It really depends on platform to platform. So there are some peer-to-peer lending platforms where you can put in as little as £500 and maybe get as much as an 8% return on that money with some good first charge security. If you invest in other platforms that may be equity, I think from as low as £100, you can probably put some money in and get a small stake. Now, the return's going to be pretty small.
Of course.
But I think it's good to put some money in and just check out the platform, make sure that...
Less risk and see how
exactly.
you feel about.
And also ask other people. It's a growing industry. Many people have never made this kind of investment before. So ask family and friends if they've ever done it, what's their experience. Try and find somebody who has got some experience and see what you can learn from them. I'm sure the other guys might have some comments on it as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I completely agree that having confidence in the platform and who's involved in the platform, very important. One thing to be wary of if you are investing in development projects is quite often, I shouldn't say quite often, in some cases, the actual people who are doing the development can have very little skin in the game. If the platform isn't doing it right, which can be risky, because if something goes wrong, they walk away and lose a very small amount of money, whereas it's the investors that are taking the risk. Yeah. So be aware of that if that's the case, and have confidence in your own due diligence, the platform's due diligence, and the actual people you're giving your money to.
Yeah.
But aside from that risk, I think crowdfunding is great. It's excellent that that's those smaller amounts of money can help contribute toward a greater project. So in the right circumstance, it can be brilliant.
And a great way, perhaps, as you say, to sort of dipping your toe into property investing for the first time.
Yeah, I think so.
Excellent. Well, Paul, let's give you your 57th question. So this is a person who has moved back home after a few years, and they are letting their flat out, and they now want to buy a small freehold house to live in. My tenant doesn't want to move, but I'm finding it impossible to sell to an investor in the current market. So if I do sell, she's going to have to go. I have no pension plan and had thought that the flat could replace that. However, I'm finding it difficult to refinance the flat in order to release the equity to buy the house. I would also have to find the 3% stamp duty. So based on all of the above, should I try and keep the flat or sell it, no longer be a landlord and have much more equity in the house that I intend to buy?
It's a very common question. I believe about half of the landlords in the UK are accidental landlords.
Right.
They're people that have kept their previous home.
Yes.
I think a few things to be aware of there is when you've bought a place as a home, you've usually bought it using fairly emotional criteria.
Yeah.
You know, the place that you like, it's usually it might be where you've grown up or the place where you want to live, and you've bought it because you like, you know, the shape of the house and it makes you feel comfortable. That's generally a fairly different criteria when it comes to making money from property. And that should be very unemotional and commercially minded, and literally, you know, to be crass about it, about making money. So the two don't usually gel in my experience, but they can in some cases. It seems from what this person said that perhaps it's not the best property investment, but you know, there's limited information there. They're struggling to sell it. They're also struggling to remortgage it. The selling might be due to the market at this point in time, or it could be just because it's not very attractive as a property investment. The remortgaging could be partially, again, due to the yield perhaps, or, you know, perhaps it's just not very attractive to lenders. Again, there's limited information, but it would all come down to whether that property makes sense as an investment. Depending on what their goals are, you know, are they looking to make cash flow from it? Are they looking to build an investable asset base, and is it therefore likely to grow in value? Or is it even viable for them to keep it, given that they're struggling to remortgage it? Because it seems it's
There's
either
got to be a
or. They
reason
need to
why,
sell it or they need to remortgage it. It might come down to which one of those two options is the easiest for them. But yes, I'm always against telling people to sell properties because it's an expensive way to release equity. I'd much prefer people to remortgage and release funds to then build, because you know, property should be a sort of mid to long term investment, and essentially remortgaging to release equity is a tax-free way of accessing your cash. Whereas when you sell, you pay agent fees, capital gains tax, you know, a whole range of things. So definitely seek advice, this person, speak with somebody who can look at the figures, look at the property and tell them whether it stacks up, and then based upon that advice, you know, follow the path that works best for them.
And take the emotion out of it. That's where bringing another advisor in would do that, wouldn't they? They would just literally look at the facts and figures as opposed to, as you say, they bought that house because they loved it and they lived in it for a while.
You know, 30 years ago, we didn't really have these questions. We've become this kind of property owners' democracy with, as you said, accidental landlords and things like that. And I think I'm always at pains to say to people, think about your fallback position. And the point you make are very valid about disposing of property, but sometimes your fallback position is more important. If the market changes, if your circumstances change, are you still covered?
Yes. I love the way that this question starts. The person says, we might be slightly mad. We might all be, but anyway, we are seriously thinking of buying a solid 1960s house that hasn't been updated for decades. It needs new double glazing, new kitchen, new bathroom, new rewiring, new decoration and carpets. However, it does look structurally sound. Would you get a survey if you're going to do everything anyway?
Okay, on a technical point, I don't think you can be slightly mad as you can't be slightly pregnant, but that's a side issue.
All right.
It's interesting that people often talk about a solid house and structurally sound when, with due respect, they may not be aware of whether that's correct or not. They've also said in the question, we want to do everything. Well, there's a whole myriad of things not mentioned there that
roofs,
might need attention. Yeah, roofs and all kinds of boundary issues. And, you know, a 60s house is of an age where there's a fair chance there could be some asbestos-containing materials within there.
Right.
There are various forms of 60s houses of which the construction is not the best. Many 60s houses are fine, I hasten to add. There are others which aren't. So the very fact that the things they're talking about are improvements wouldn't perhaps inherently improve the insulation capability of it or the structural adequacy of it compared to what some lenders may view on certain types of 60s housing. So I've said it before on the programme that people often come to us and say, I'd like a survey, I'm concerned about A, B and C. Well, actually, when we get there, A, B and C are fine, and it's X, Y and Z which are the problem.
Yeah.
But that's because it's not their area of expertise.
Of course.
And to say what could go wrong is a bit like going to the doctors and saying what could be wrong with me. There are lots and lots of different things. So yes, you've got to have a survey. Even if you're going to do all of those things, there are many, many, many other things.
That possibly hidden, that the laymen aren't, they're not
exactly,
going to see.
people aren't even thinking about them at all. Even things like protected species in the roof or in the eaves that could stop you doing things that, you know, it's our job to pick that up. Japanese knotweed is another thing that we've spoken about before on the programme, and other plants and other issues like that, trees, all kinds of things. So it is a myriad possibility option. So certainly do get professional advice.
And you mentioned about 1960s houses. They've said that it's a solid 1960s house. When you were talking about that before, did you mean that it's like a non-standard construction?
Not necessarily not. It could be a non-standard by current definitions, but equally, in my view, there were elements of 60s housing which weren't put together in the best possible way and haven't really stood the test of time. You know, I've seen lots of 60s housing estates being demolished. Well, that's crazy when we've got houses that last 150, 200 years, that we're demolishing houses 40 or 50 years later. So, yes, it may be a solid house. It may be a house which isn't fantastically put together but is still basically reasonably sound. But get the advice and be sure.
Have the survey.
Have the survey, says the surveyor.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Garrett. That's all we've got time for this half of the show, but join us after the break for more questions for our experts here in the studio. Welcome back to this 150th episode of Property Question Time. Just to remind you, I'm joined today by Simon Zutshi.
Hello.
Paul Mahoney.
Hello.
And Garrett O'Hanlon. Hello. So, gentlemen, let's crack on with the next lot of questions. Simon, for you, I am looking at options at the moment as to what to do. My grandmother has early dementia and is moving in with us in an annex. She owns a bungalow at the moment worth £250,000, and we are looking at what to do with this bungalow. It could be rented out for about £700 per calendar month, but that doesn't seem to be a very good return on the £250,000 value. If we were to sell, what are the options open to investing it to produce a better income? We would look for a long-term investment, and we need the income to cover carer fees for home visits.
Okay, so a couple of things here. First of all, a £750 return on a £250,000 property is not a great return. So I would think it's probably worth selling that asset. If it's been our own home, there's no tax to pay on it. And in fact, it might be a good time for her to distribute some of that income through the family. However, if there are fees to be paid in the future for care, I personally would take that money and invest it into some high cash generating cash flow properties that will give an income that could be used to cover some of those expenses in the future.
Right.
So I'd really want to sweat that money and work it as hard as possible. It's not a huge amount of money, so it would come within the inheritance tax personal allowance. So unless she's got lots of other money and pictures and things that might be valuable, there probably wouldn't be a capital, wouldn't be an inheritance tax liability, sorry. So, but it's just about getting that money working hard. And probably houses of multiple occupation, subject to being in the right area. That is a bit more work and effort than a normal property, but you know, fees for care homes and care can be very expensive. So to create the most of income is what I'd want to do.
It's whether the grandchildren that she's moving in with have got the time and the energy to actually do that for her.
You can find certain letting agents who have the skills to look after those kind of properties. So I think doing some research would be really important to find the right area for that kind of property, find someone who can manage it for you so they're not taking on the extra burden and responsibility, and you can still generate a good cash flow even if someone else is managing it for you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Paul. So, this is quite a long question, but we'll fire through it. I'm due some inheritance in the next week or two, and I've been thinking hard about what I want to do with it. 1, should I pay off the majority of my mortgage? 2, bank it and just use it for an easier life, more holidays, fun for a few years? Or 3, a buy-to-let? I do love the idea of being mortgage-free myself, so number 1 is super appealing. However, I know for a fact that if I pay my mortgage off, I will end up just being a little lazier with work and earning less, so I won't really notice the difference. The second option would be amazing to do for a few years, but I've no doubt that I would regret it long term. And that leaves option 3, the buy to let. I could get a property with around an 8% yield fairly easily in my city. And I know I still will work hard if I do this option, but then I'll also have an asset of another home and an addition of extra income to start paying down my own mortgage, or maybe even go towards a second buy to let. However, I know nothing about rentals. Will I not be making as much as I think? And is there anything else I should consider before doing this option?
Okay, good question. think they did answer their own question
I
a little
think
bit
so
there.
too.
The logical answer in my mind is 3. We'll go through each though. Option number, let me clarify that. They haven't said much about the rest of their financial position.
No, they haven't.
But it sounds from the way it's been worded that this would be their first buy-to-let, and
It
they
also
probably
sounds like they might be self-employed. If they don't, they might not work as hard.
yeah, or on point 1, if they are already quite wealthy and are in a strong financial position, have all the income they need from their investments, then maybe paying off their mortgage is a good idea. But debt is cheap at the moment. You know, most mortgage rates, especially home loans, are sort of 1.5% to 3%. They've said that they can achieve an 8% yield in their current area. If they're going to leverage that cash they have, the yield on the cash will probably be much better than that, 10% plus ideally. So by paying it off their home loan, they're going to save themselves between 1.5% and 3% on that money, or they can invest it and get 10% plus. So, in my mind, it's logical to invest it, especially if they aren't quite in the financial position as yet as what they'd like to be, in a few years' time. So sort of that would better utilise their resources. It would not only give them a better yield, but hopefully allow them to start building an investable asset base so that, in 10, 15, 20 years, hopefully they'll be able to replace their employment income with their investment income.
Yes, absolutely.
So that would lead to number 3 being the most suitable option. Number 2 is essentially financial suicide. It's a personal choice. If they want to go and blow the money,
Perhaps they could take a bit for a spa day.
That's completely up to them. But yes, without a doubt, they would regret spending the money on holidays and a more expensive lifestyle. Again, in my mind, it would be logical for them to try to create that better lifestyle by investing the money. And that could be, very passive, or it could be more proactive, depending on their skill set and the time they have available to them. But yes, I think 3 is the most logical point, and they've almost answered that for themselves. It helps them better utilise the money, get a better return on it. They'd keep working and maintain their own personal expenses separate to that, whilst building something that's hopefully going to create a passive income at some point in the future and allow them to be a bit more comfortable without having to work too much.
Yeah. So they'd actually be having 1, 2 from 3.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great, thank you so much. So finally, a question for you, Garrett. We are in the process of buying our first property, and we want to get the roof specifically checked. I'm happy with the rest of the house. Goes back to your earlier point, doesn't it? I originally wanted to get a full building survey done, but on looking at some examples, a lot of them end up saying the roof will need looking at by someone else anyway. So do I go for a full roof survey? I'm struggling to make a decision. I don't want to make a mistake by getting the wrong thing and then having someone else have to come in and have to spend more money anyway. The building survey with one company will cost £500, or a roof survey will be £380 with someone else. So obviously, I wouldn't want to end up having to get both. Any advice?
Yes, a few interesting points there again. Once again, we've got somebody who feels confident that they know enough about a very complicated building to say it's okay, but they don't know about roofs, which is a worry. The point, we don't do partial surveys on bits and pieces, because the thing is, a building is a fully integrated element. Every part interacts with another part. So if, for example, somebody says, can you go along and just look at the roof? Well, if we turn up and we can see there are tiny hairline cracks which indicate cavity wall tie failure, do we just ignore that because that's critical to them? And as professionals, we should be really following a trial, even if we're not being paid for it, which we don't really want to do. So I think the partial surveys is a dangerous thing. In terms of what they were saying about seeing reports where people just say, refer to someone else, I hate that. Surveyor's reports should not say that, unless they are suggesting that here is the problem which we've identified, and now you need to go somewhere to get prices for it, which is a different thing.
Yes.
I think if they read carefully the other reports which they've seen, hopefully they're couched in those terms. But again, with roofs, there are many, many things that can be right and wrong, not just with the roof itself, but with the framework. And again, all elements interact together. So do get a detailed survey. Do, as they seem to have done, check out people's reports and see what you think of them, ask questions. But I would, at all costs, avoid that partial survey because I think it's very misleading.
Yeah. And as you say, none of us are, well, you are, but we're not experts when we go into a house. There'd be something that we could miss so easily.
Yeah, and it is that fit. People do feel, you know, it takes a minimum of 5 years to qualify in what we do. So they will say, my friend's a builder and he says it's okay. He might be a fantastic builder, but that's his expertise. I can't lay a brick wall, and I doubt that he can do a detailed survey, in fairness to both of us. So go to the right people for the advice, which is what comes through this programme all the time, really.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. We've come to the end of our 150th episode. Thank you so much for being with us today. And don't forget, if you've got any questions for our experts, go onto the website www.property-tv.co.uk or send us a direct email to info@propertytelevision.co.uk. All that's left is for me to say thank you to our guests for today. So thank you, Simon Zutshi.
Thank you.
Paul Mahoney.
Thank you.
And Garrett O'Hanlon.
Thank you very much.
I'm Shona Lindsay, and we'll see you very soon on Property Question Time. Thanks very much. Bye.